He pointed at me across a room full of people who controlled more combined wealth than most small countries. And he smiled the way men smile when they want an audience for their cruelty. "This," Preston Aldridge said, adjusting his cufflinks and letting his voice carry just far enough that the cluster of investors nearest to us could hear clearly, "is Thomas, my son-in-law." He paused for effect, the way a comedian pauses before the punchline. "He works in a little office doing Excel work, spreadsheets, data, that sort of thing." Another pause. "He'll never be anyone particularly important." A few people laughed. Not cruel, hysterical laughter. The polished kind. The kind that comes with expensive suits and a glass of scotch in hand. The kind that says, "I understand I'm watching a man be diminished, and I find it mildly amusing." I stood there. I smiled. I did not say a word. Preston had been doing this for 3 years. Little comments, quiet dismissals, offhand remarks at the right moment in front of the right people. He had built a career on knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. He was, by all measurable accounts, good at it. What Preston did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that 18 months before that night I had sold my data analytics company for a number I have never disclosed publicly. And what Preston especially did not know was that the note I left at the reception desk of his company's headquarters the next morning, right next to my empty office, would be the last thing he expected to find. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Before we go any further, I want to ask you to hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because I tell stories like this every week. Stories about ordinary people who get pushed too far and discover something extraordinary on the other side of it. If that's the kind of story you need right now, hit the like button so more people can find this video. Drop a comment below and tell me, has someone ever underestimated you at exactly the wrong moment? I want to know. Now, let me tell you about Thomas. My name is Thomas Calloway. I am 43 years old and I have lived in Atlanta, Georgia for the last 14 years. I am not a flashy man. I drive a 2019 Subaru Outback with 87,000 miles on it. I eat lunch at the same deli on Peachtree Street 3 times a week. My office, the one I chose to keep, even after everything changed, is on the 6th floor of a building in Midtown that doesn't have a doorman and charges reasonable rent. The kind of building where plumbers have offices on the 3rd floor and a small architecture firm runs out of the 4th. Nobody walks past it and thinks, something significant is happening in there. That was deliberate. That was always deliberate. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, about 80 miles south of Atlanta, in a house where nobody talked much about money except when there wasn't enough of it. My father worked in logistics for a food distribution company. My mother taught 3rd grade for 26 years. We were not poor in the way that breaks people, but we were the kind of family that knows the difference between wants and needs before most children have the vocabulary for it. I was good at math. Not the showy kind of math that wins trophies. The quiet kind. The kind where you look at a column of numbers and you see a story inside them that nobody else has noticed yet. My high school guidance counselor called it analytical thinking. I called it how my brain worked. I went to Georgia Tech on a partial scholarship and spent the rest of the tuition on student loans that I paid off, slowly and methodically, over the first 7 years of my career. I got a degree in computer science. I went to work for a mid-sized consulting firm in Atlanta. I was good at my job. Not spectacular. Not the kind of young man who gets written up in trade publications or invited to speak at conferences. Just good, thorough, reliable. The kind of person whose work holds up 6 months later when someone goes back to check. I started building Callaway Analytics out of that same office on the 6th floor in 2014. Just me, one contract employee named Nathan Briggs who did client relations, and a laptop that had already been through 2 years of hard use. We focused on predictive data modeling for mid-sized businesses in the Southeast. Not the glamorous end of the market. Manufacturers, regional logistics companies, healthcare networks trying to figure out where their supply chain was leaking money. Unglamorous clients with real problems. The work was good. The work was actually very good. I won't bore you with every year of it, because this story isn't about the building. It's about what happened once I had built it. But I will tell you this. By 2022, Callaway Analytics had 11 full-time employees, 17 long-term clients, and a proprietary modeling system that a larger national firm had been watching quietly for 2 years before they finally called. The acquisition closed in February of 2023. I kept my office. I kept my title. I kept showing up on Tuesdays and Thursdays to work on the integration process and answer my emails and eat my lunch from the deli on Peachtree. I told almost nobody what had happened. Nathan knew. My attorney knew. My accountant knew. And my wife, Genevieve, knew. Genevieve's father did not know. I met Genevieve Aldridge at a fundraiser for the Atlanta Community Food Bank in the spring of 2018. She was working the check-in table. I was there because one of my clients had donated a table and then had a scheduling conflict, so they gave me 2 seats. I went alone. Genevieve had dark hair pulled back and a way of making every person who walked up to the check-in table feel like they were expected and welcome. She smiled at me when I gave her my name and I said something forgettable, and she laughed anyway. We talked for 45 minutes at the end of the night when the tables were clearing out. She was a landscape architect. She designed public green spaces for the City of Atlanta's Parks Department and did private residential work on the side. She had a dry sense of humor and an enormous amount of patience, and she told me later that what made her give me her number was that I asked her 3 questions about her work and actually listened to the answers. I was not looking for anyone. I had dated, casually, without much investment, for most of my 30s. My company took most of what I had to give in those years, and I was not pretending otherwise. But Genevieve was different in the specific way that changes your arithmetic. After 4 months of dinners and long weekend drives out to the North Georgia mountains, I was not someone who could imagine the calendar without her in it. We got engaged in 2019. We were married in the spring of 2020 in a small ceremony in Decatur with 20 people, and Genevieve's mother Carolyn crying beautifully, and her father Preston standing very straight at the front of the room, with an expression that said he was tolerating the proceedings. I noticed that expression. I filed it away. Preston Aldridge was the CEO of Aldridge Capital Partners, a private equity firm based in Buckhead that had been founded by his own father in 1981. Preston had inherited the firm at 41, after his father's retirement, and had spent the 23 years since then turning it from a regional operation into something that moved real money across the Southeast and beyond. He was, by the measures that matter in that world, successful. He was also a man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms where he was always, without exception, the most important person present. When you grow up that way, and Preston had, because his father had raised him inside the firm the way some men raise sons inside churches, you develop a particular relationship with hierarchy. You stop seeing the world as people. You start seeing it as tiers. I was, to Preston Aldridge, a tier below his daughter. This was not personal. This was simply how the math worked in his mind. Genevieve had been educated at Vanderbilt. She had built a professional practice. She moved in circles that Preston recognized and approved of. She had married a man who worked in a modest office doing work that Preston couldn't entirely describe at dinner parties. He does something with data, is how I heard Preston explain me once at a birthday party for Genevieve's Aunt Diane. He said it with the faint tonal quality of a man describing a vaguely disappointing appliance. Genevieve heard it too. She came and found me on the back porch afterward and stood next to me and said, quietly, "I'm sorry about that." And I told her she didn't need to apologize. I meant it. Preston was what Preston was. I was not interested in his approval, and I was not hurt by its absence. What I was watching, carefully, in the way that people who work with data watch things, collecting, categorizing, storing information for later. The comments came regularly over the following years. Some were small, the way Preston would introduce me at family gatherings. "This is Genevieve's husband, Tom. He's in the data field." As if data were a minor agricultural product rather than the most valuable commercial asset of the 21st century. Some were larger. There was a Thanksgiving, 2 years into our marriage, when Preston's business partner asked me what kind of numbers I worked with, and before I could answer, Preston said, "Oh, small company stuff. Regional clients. Nothing complicated." And then he moved the conversation along. I let him. Every time. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't have the words, but because I have always believed, with the conviction of someone who has seen enough data to know it's true, that the most powerful response to a man who dismisses you is to let him keep doing it until the gap between what he believes and what is real becomes undeniable. I was patient. I was very, very patient. And I was building something that would eventually make the patience irrelevant. The acquisition of Callaway Analytics was not something I pursued. The call came from a senior VP at a national firm, I will not name them here, who had been tracking our work for 2 years. They flew down to Atlanta in November of 2022, 2 of them, and we had lunch at a restaurant in Midtown that was not impressive enough to make anyone feel like a target, which was intentional. They made an offer. I counter-offered. We went back and forth with lawyers and accountants and long calls on Sunday afternoons for 3 months. The deal closed in February. I signed the paperwork in my attorney's office on a Tuesday morning, drove back to my office on the 6th floor, ate a sandwich from the deli, and answered my emails. I told Genevieve that night, over dinner at home. She cried, not from sadness, but from the kind of relief that comes when years of watching someone work at something enormous finally resolves into an outcome. She held my face in her hands and she said, "I always knew." I believed her. Genevieve had always known. The terms of the deal included a confidentiality agreement about the purchase price, which I was more than happy to sign. I have no interest in announcing numbers. I kept my office because the office is where I think, and thinking is still my work, even if the ownership structure has changed. I kept my title, Senior Analyst, Callaway Analytics, now a division, because titles are for other people's comfort, not mine. I told Nathan, I told my accountant, I told Genevieve, I told no one else, including Preston. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it matters. I did not tell Preston. Not as a strategy, not as setup for a reveal. I didn't tell him because it simply did not occur to me that his opinion of me required updating. He had formed his view. He was welcome to it. My net worth had no bearing on whether his view was valid, and it certainly had no bearing on who I was. But Preston, it turned out, was about to give me a reason to revisit that decision. The investor dinner was held at a private club in Buckhead on a Thursday evening in September. Preston had been building toward this event for months. A gathering of 12 significant investors for what he called, with characteristic grandeur, a strategic alignment dinner, meaning he was pitching them on the next phase of Aldridge Capital's growth and wanted the social theater of a formal setting to make them feel chosen. Genevieve had been asked to attend as family, to give the evening a sense of warmth and personal connection. I came with her. I wore a dark suit. I ordered a scotch I didn't particularly want because it seemed like the kind of evening where you hold something. The room was what you'd expect. 12 men, all men, in the kind of suits that don't wrinkle. The club itself had been built in 1924 and had the kind of mahogany confidence that comes from having survived long enough to never feel insecure. Preston worked the room the way he always did, which was beautifully. I will give him that. He moved from group to group with the ease of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, and he made each conversation feel like it was the one he'd been most looking forward to. Then he got to me. I was standing with Genevieve near the window, talking to a man named Dale Forsyth, who managed a family office out of Chattanooga and who had, in the 15 minutes we'd been talking, revealed himself to be funny and genuinely curious about urban agriculture. Genevieve had been describing a project she was working on for Piedmont Park, and Dale was asking good questions, and it was, for a brief moment, a genuinely pleasant conversation. Preston arrived. He inserted himself between Dale and the window with the smooth efficiency of someone who has decided he owns whatever space he's standing in. He looked at Dale, and then he looked at me, and something happened in his expression, a small calculation, a decision, and he said it. "Dale, you haven't met my son-in-law. This is Thomas." He gestured at me with a small, performative wave of his hand. "He works in a little office doing Excel work, spreadsheets, data, that sort of thing." He smiled the smile. "He'll never be anyone particularly important." I heard Dale Forsyth laugh softly, politely, the way you laugh at a joke you're not sure you've fully understood. I heard someone nearby, one of the other investors, a man I'd been briefly introduced to named Clark, laugh more completely. I felt Genevieve go still beside me. I looked at Preston. He was already moving on, his eyes sliding back toward Dale, ready to discuss something more interesting than me. I smiled. I took a sip of my scotch, and I said, pleasantly and with complete composure, "Good to meet everyone." And then I spent the rest of the evening being exactly what Preston believed I was: quiet, unmemorable, appropriately invisible. I watched him work the room. I watched the investors nod and lean in and fill their glasses. I watched the whole performance from the edge of it, and I made a decision that had been waiting for the right moment to arrive. The decision was not about money. It was not about status. It was about the specific clarity that comes when someone finally shows you, unambiguously, who they are. Preston did not see me as a person. He saw me as a category, and he had just performed that categorization in front of 12 men whose professional opinions he cared about enormously, using me as a prop to make himself feel elevated. I was done being patient. Genevieve and I drove home mostly in silence. She was the one who finally spoke, on the highway, looking straight ahead. "He's never going to change," she said. "No," I agreed. "I'm sorry." She said it the way she always said it, not as a performance, but as something real and worn from use. "Don't be," I said. "I've been thinking." She glanced over at me then. Genevieve knows my thinking face. She waited. "I'm going to make a change at the office," I said. "It's time." That was all I said that night. But by the time we got home, I had a plan. The next morning, I got to my office at 7:30. Dana, who managed the reception desk for the 3 firms on the 6th floor, was already there with her coffee and her scheduling system and her uncomplicated efficiency. I sat down and worked until 9. Then I called Nathan. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. Nathan Briggs has known me since 2014. He has seen me at every stage of what Callaway Analytics became. He is the kind of person who gets told things directly, which is the only reason we have worked together for 11 years. "I'm transitioning the office," I told him, "effective immediately. I'm going to be working remotely for the next phase, and I'm going to be stepping into the advisory role I've been offered at the parent company's headquarters." I paused. "I want to clear the physical office this week." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Because of last night?" he asked. He knew about the dinner. He knows about Preston, because he's had to build the narrative for years every time clients ask why the CEO of Callaway Analytics drives a used Subaru and eats at a deli counter. "Because it's time," I said. "But yes. Also because of last night." Nathan laughed, not unkindly. "Okay. What do you need from me?" "Just help me box up the important files," I said. "Everything else can stay or go to storage." We spent the rest of that week methodically, quietly clearing the office on the 6th floor. I did not announce it. I did not send emails. I did not post anything. I simply stopped being physically present in the space that Preston Aldridge had spent 3 years imagining as evidence of my limitations. The last thing I did, on Friday afternoon, was write a note. I left it at the reception desk with Dana, who read it and looked up at me with an expression that said she'd been waiting for something like this. The note was addressed to Preston Aldridge. It said, "Preston, I don't know if you'll come here looking for me, but if you do, I want you to have this. You introduced me to your investors last Thursday as a man who works in a little office doing Excel work. You told them I would never be anyone particularly important." Some of them laughed. I smiled. I smiled because I was thinking about this moment. Callaway Analytics was acquired 18 months ago. I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday in February of 2023. I kept this office and my old title because I value my work, not my image. I value my privacy. And if I'm being honest, I value the particular satisfaction of watching a man like you make assumptions. The office is empty now. I've moved on to the next thing. The next thing is larger than this thing was. I want you to know that I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a man who stopped being curious about people a long time ago, and that has cost you something you don't know how to name. It has also cost you a relationship with your daughter that she is too generous to tell you is already damaged. I'm not angry, I'm clear. Take care of yourself. Thomas Callaway. I did not send a copy to anyone. I did not photograph it. I put it in an envelope, wrote his name on the front, and left it with Dana with instructions to give it to him if and when he came looking. Then I drove home. He came on a Monday morning, 3 weeks later. Genevieve told me afterward what Dana had described. Preston had arrived at the building at 9:15, which is earlier than he usually leaves his house, which means he had been planning this, which means something had happened in the 3 weeks between the dinner and that Monday that had made him move. What had happened was Dale Forsyth. Dale, it turned out, was not just a pleasant man who asked good questions about urban agriculture. Dale had done what curious, thorough people do. He had gone home from that dinner and looked me up. My name, my company, my firm, the acquisition. He found what there was to find, which was not much because I had been deliberately quiet about it, but what there was to find was enough. He had called Preston the following week and asked a question that Preston could not answer cleanly, and that question had apparently lodged itself in Preston's chest like a splinter. I don't know exactly what Dale said to him. I don't need to know. What I know is that Preston came to the office on a Monday morning with what Dana described as an expression she had never seen on a man who typically wore his confidence like a second suit. He rode the elevator to the 6th floor. He walked to where the door of Callaway Analytics had been. The door was still there. The nameplate was still there. But the lights inside were off. The desks were clear. The shelves were empty. The room had the specific quality of a space that used to hold something important and now holds nothing at all. Dana had the envelope ready. She had been ready for 3 weeks. She walked over and handed it to him without a word. He stood in the hallway of the 6th floor of a building without a doorman, holding a sealed envelope with his name on it, in a space that had once housed the small office of a man he had introduced to investors as no one particularly important. He opened it. I don't know how long he stood there reading it. Dana said she went back to her desk. She gave him the privacy of the moment. What I know is that he called Genevieve that afternoon. She was in the middle of a site visit for the Piedmont Park project when her phone rang. She let it go to voicemail. She called me first. "Dad called," she said. "I know," I said. He sounded different. I imagine he did. There was a pause. Genevieve is a person who chooses her words carefully, which is one of the reasons I love her. "Did you plan this?" she asked. "All of it? From the beginning?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I didn't plan the dinner," I said. "He planned the dinner. I planned the morning after." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me, because Genevieve almost never surprises me. She said, "Good." I returned Preston's call 2 days later. We talked for 40 minutes. He did most of the talking, which is unusual for him, and which told me more than the words did. He asked questions he had never bothered to ask before. About the firm. About the work. About how long it had been in the building. How it had grown. What it had cost me personally to build something in the years before it became what it became. He did not apologize in the clean, direct way that some people apologize. He is not built for that. What he did was talk around it, which for a man like Preston is a significant movement towards something he would normally never approach at all. He said things like, "I didn't understand what you were doing," and "I should have asked more." These are not apologies, but they are, from Preston Aldridge, something. I listened. I did not reassure him. I did not tell him it was fine. I did not perform forgiveness I did not yet feel. What I said at the end of the call was this: "I'm not interested in a relationship built around your approval, Preston. I never was. But I'm also not interested in no relationship at all. That would hurt Genevieve. And Genevieve is the reason I'm on this call." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." It is not a resolution. It is not the kind of ending where everyone gathers and the music swells and the man who was wrong says everything right. It is the kind of ending that real life produces, which is messier and slower and without a clear final scene. But I will tell you what it is. It is the first conversation I have ever had with Preston Aldridge in which he was listening more than he was performing. And that, from a man who has spent 43 years watching data for the meaningful signal inside the noise, is the most interesting thing I've seen in a long time. There is a version of this story where I walk into that dinner and announce the acquisition to the room, where I correct Preston in front of his investors, right there, in real time, with the satisfaction of watching his face change. I have thought about that version. I understand its appeal. But here is what I know about data, and about people, and about the difference between a moment and a pattern. A correction in a crowded room proves something. But an empty office and a handwritten note reveals something. It shows a man his own assumptions, quietly, without an audience, without theater, without the option of performing his way through the moment. Preston Aldridge spent 3 years using me as a prop in his own narrative. I simply waited until the moment when I could hand him back the narrative and let him read what was actually written in it. Some things are worth being patient for. I still drive the Subaru. I still eat at the deli on Peachtree 3 times a week. I am working now from a home office and from occasional visits to the parent company's headquarters in another city, on problems that are larger and more complicated than the ones I worked on before, which is the only kind of problem I have ever been interested in. Genevieve is finishing the Piedmont Park project. It's going to be extraordinary. Green space connecting 3 historically underserved neighborhoods, designed with the same quiet thoroughness she brings to everything. Nobody walking through it will know her name. She wouldn't want them to. We are, in that way, well matched. This is the ultimate masterclass in underestimation. Preston made the fatal mistake of confusing modesty with mediocrity. He saw a man with a Subaru and an Excel sheet and thought he'd found a punching bag for his ego. He didn't realize he was dealing with the smartest person in the room. Thomas didn't need to shout his net worth at that dinner. Why? Because true power doesn't need an audience. By waiting for the morning after, Thomas didn't just correct Preston. He dismantled his entire worldview. He left him standing in an empty office with a note that proved Preston wasn't just wrong about Thomas, he was wrong about everything that actually matters. The takeaway? Never mistake silence for weakness. While Preston was busy performing, Thomas was busy building. There is a specific kind of victory that comes from letting someone finish their performance, only to show them they were acting on the wrong stage.